Hey guys, Derek here from Back to Reality. And today I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you about priorities. But to do that, I first need to rewind a little bit to give you some context. You see, when I was a child, like most young boys, my father was my hero. To me, he was like Superman or Hercules. He was the biggest, toughest, and smartest guy I knew. It didn't matter how complicated or difficult the challenge, my dad was the right guy for the job. But there was more to it than just his abilities, because he also lived what most would consider to be an unconventional life. For better or for worse, he did what he wanted. He did it his way, and he never seemed to care what other people thought about it. When I was 4, my parents separated, and so I began seeing my dad only on weekends. But in a way, that just made our time together even more exciting, because I never knew exactly where we'd be sleeping or what we'd be doing. I don't know how my poor mom handled the uncertainty back then, but without fail, I was always immensely proud of our adventures. In many ways, it was my dad who taught me to appreciate nature. One of our favorite pastimes was taking long walks in the woods, learning to make shelter and start a fire. He taught me how to get my hands dirty, explore my surroundings, and trust myself to figure things out. When I was around 6 or 7, my dad spent an entire summer living in a tent trailer in the woods, the back of a huge field. The old tent was made of heavy canvas, and he used tarps to create a large covered porch. There was no electricity, no running water, not even a toilet. I'm sure outside observers would have thought that he was crazy, but to me, it was heaven. I remember the campfires and the starry nights. I remember catching fireflies in the field and the two of us singing along to the radio. I'm sure things were difficult for him back then. I now know that both my parents had their struggles, but in my eyes, everything was perfect. When I was 9, my grandfather passed away, and that's the first time I can ever remember seeing my dad cry. Vulnerability. Talk about a shock. But he was honest with me about his feelings. He told me that crying was normal and healthy and didn't make you any less of a man. It was a valuable lesson in and of itself, but what I also learned that day was that despite his tough guy persona, my dad was human. Through my teenage years, I was slowly exposed to more of my dad's vulnerabilities. But he continued to be honest with me about the challenges he faced and tried to use his own difficulties as teaching opportunities for me. He felt that if I could learn from his mistakes, then in a way, they were all worth it. But unfortunately, as the years passed and my weekends slowly became filled with summer jobs and girlfriends, I eventually stopped having regular visits with my dad altogether. Looking back, I'm sure that was a difficult period of adjustment for him, but he still did his best to support me in my new activities and distractions and tried not to take it personally. Now, as an adult, we really only get together on special occasions, birthdays and Christmas, and despite our best intentions, life just always gets in the way. No matter how hard I try, there's always other commitments and obligations, and they always seem to take precedence in the moment. But it's okay, because there's always next week, or next month, or so we tell ourselves. And I did tell myself. Almost daily, in fact. Right up until I received a phone call that changed everything. But true to form, I almost didn't pick it up. You see, when the phone rang, I was busy outside reinstalling the mower deck on our lawn tractor. And after that, I had planned on doing some garden chores because it was May 5th and we needed to get ready for the growing season. Spring was well underway and I'd been looking forward to this all week while stuck at the office. This was going to be the year that we got our plants in the ground on time, so whoever it was on the phone could just leave a message. I'd call them back later or tomorrow. Talking on the phone just wasn't a priority right then. But luckily, after a few rings, I broke from tradition, dropped my tools, and picked up the phone. It was my stepmom. My dad had just had a stroke and was taken away by ambulance. The rest is a blur. As Paula and I raced to the hospital, I called aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in months and years. When we arrived at the emergency room, I was greeted by doctors who asked me about his wishes regarding resuscitation and life support and heroic measures. Just don't let him die, was all I could get out. After 2 days, Dad was moved from the ER to the neuroscience acute care unit and then eventually to the ICU. For the first week and a half, the three of us practically lived in the hospital. But after that, Paula and my stepmom understandably had to go back to work. But I couldn't. Let them fire me, I thought. None of that matters anymore. You see, in previous videos, we've talked quite a bit about getting back to reality. It's the name of our channel, after all, and to us, that mostly means stripping away all the unnecessary distractions, reevaluating your cultural expectations, and focusing on what truly matters. But despite my best intentions, as it turns out in some parts of my life, I wasn't really doing a very good job. But tragedy has a funny way of helping us filter out all the background noise and hone in on what's actually important. At the end of the day, survival, both for yourself and those you care about, is essential. Without it, nothing else matters. And so I simply dropped everything. Before the phone call, I had really important projects on the go at work. Dropped. I was in the middle of various creative pursuits. Dropped. We had seedlings in the basement that were in need of transplanting into the garden. Dropped. There were countless little worries and anxieties, problems that felt so significant, so important, things that kept me awake at night. Dropped. In the face of losing my father, none of that stuff mattered anymore. So I simply discarded them without a thought. And so I stayed. After all those years of taking our relationship for granted, I wasn't about to leave his side now, when he needed me the most. I became obsessed. When I wasn't reading to him or playing familiar music or just watching his fingertips for any signs of movement, I was busy researching the functions of the basal ganglia and the thalamus, conditions like hydrocephalus and dysphagia, and procedures like extraventricular drains and tracheostomies. I became part of his medical team, fully consumed by my father's status, micromanaging his vital signs, and glued to the various monitors surrounding his bed. This has been the absolute worst experience of my entire life, but I am so grateful to have been a part of it. We don't yet know what my father's future is going to look like. The doctors keep reminding me that there's a long and bumpy road ahead of us. But for now, at least we're still on the road. And we're on it together. Dad's finally awake and in good spirits. Most of what he says is unintelligible, but in his fleeting moments of lucidity, I know that he gets to open his eyes and see that despite their complicated history, his son has made him a priority. And right now, that matters to me more than anything else. So I'll leave you with this. And it's an obvious one, but if there's something you've been putting off or someone you've been meaning to call, please do it today. Do it now. Life is short and complicated, and there will always be other priorities. But tomorrow isn't certain. So make the time and make the call. And there's one more thing. You may notice that despite everything I just said about being by my dad's side, I'm not actually in the hospital right now. I'm at home in our forest. And I'd like to really quickly explain why, because I think it's relevant. As somebody who's currently going through it, I suddenly understand why people talk so much about the importance of looking after yourself when playing the role of caregiver. It's really easy to forget about eating and sleeping or even just getting a haircut when you're so wrapped up in someone else's well-being. For example, in the first 2 weeks alone, I lost over 14 pounds. And not that I'm sad to see them go, but living on caffeine and adrenaline is not exactly the healthiest way to do it. Plus, I've also lost count of the number of people who've recently told me that I'm not looking all that well, and that they're worried about me. Eventually, when everyone starts saying the same thing, it's probably a good idea to pay attention. Dropping everything was the right move for me in that moment. But just because some things aren't as important as my father doesn't mean they're not important at all. We still need to take some time for ourselves. Which is why for the last few nights, Paula and I have left the hospital before dark, and slowly but surely started planting out our vegetable garden as the sun sets. It's not much, but that little bit of normalcy has been tremendously beneficial for our well-being. And today, I decided to take the time for a short walk in the woods, and to express some of my feelings with all of you. So far, that seems pretty beneficial too. So as always, thanks for being here. Even though this communications medium is mostly one-directional, it still really helps to know that you're all out there listening. So take care of yourselves. We'll see you soon.